Picture this. The camera glides over water so blue it looks photoshopped, then banks left toward a pair of volcanic spires rising straight out of the sea. The indigenous Kalinago called this island Huanora, where the iguana is found. Nowadays we call it Saint Lucia, tucked neatly in the Lesser Antilles, just north of St. Vincent, south of Martinique, square in the Caribbean's "if Europe fought over it, it's probably here" zone. But today, forget the brochures. We're starting in 1664, when English Governor Thomas Warner wrote that the island was of strategic situation. Translation: someone in London wanted a rock to point cannons from. And judging by the number of times the French and British fought over this place, 14 times, they clearly agreed. Imagine two kids fighting over a toy neither actually wants to play with, but both refuse to let go. Except here, the toy was an island already full of people, ecosystems, trade networks, and political relationships. Classic colonial move. Discover a place by ignoring the entire population standing right there. Look closer. Beyond the Pythons, dense rainforest climbs into ridgelines that once confused British surveyors so much they literally mapped some mountains twice. Every river mouth, every cove, every hidden valley. A witness to centuries of negotiation, invasion, plantation schemes, rebellions, and survival. The beauty is stunning, which makes the incoming chaos feel even louder. And out there, somewhere between the misty peaks and the pounding surf, lies the quiet truth. This island never stopped resisting. Before 1500, before Europeans even knew this archipelago existed, the Kalinago people were already here, living in longhouses near river mouths where fresh water met the Caribbean Sea. The island they called Huanora stretched 27 miles north to south, volcanic peaks rising into cloud forests where rain fell so reliably you could set schedules by it. Cassava bread dried on wooden racks in the morning sun, the starchy roots grated and pressed until the poisonous juice drained away, then baked on clay griddles. Cotton hammocks swayed under the trade winds, woven tight enough to support sleepers but loose enough to let air circulate through humid nights. Canoes carved from gommier trees, massive ancient specimens that could take months to hollow properly, sliced across the channels between islands, carrying traders, diplomats, and families visiting relatives on Dominica or Martinique or Grenada. The Kalinago inherited these maritime routes from earlier Igneri and Arawak communities, networks refined over centuries of inter-island exchange. They grew crops in rotation: cassava, sweet potatoes, beans, peppers, tobacco. They fished with nets woven from cotton fiber and hooks carved from bone. They knew which plants healed: the bitter sap that closed wounds, the leaves that reduced fever, the roots that eased childbirth pain. Their governance systems managed shared resources, settled disputes through council deliberation, organized collective defense against threats. When the French missionary Jean-Baptiste du Tertre arrived in 1654, he begrudgingly admitted the Kalinago governed their islands with admirable order. Translation: Europeans were shocked that people they expected to civilize were already civilized, with functional political systems, sophisticated ecological knowledge, and social structures that had maintained stability for generations. Picture a Kalinago boy watching fireflies circle the trees at night, his grandmother teaching him which roots stopped fever, which bark sealed wounds, which stars guided canoes home when fog obscured the coastline. Knowledge systems shaped by rainforest rhythms, tidal patterns, hurricane seasons, and community responsibility. No written records in European archives, but oral histories passed through generations carried the weight of law, the precision of science, the authority of lived experience. Civilizations don't need stone cathedrals to be sophisticated. They need functional systems for resource management, conflict resolution, knowledge transmission, and collective survival, all of which the Kalinago had perfected long before anyone sailed west, looking for India, and found something else entirely. But Europe wasn't sailing for cultural exchange or mutual learning. They were sailing for extraction, for gold and spices and territory. And they'd just spotted their next target in the Lesser Antilles. The first Europeans who showed up did so by accident, which should tell you something about the quality of their navigation. In 1605, an English ship called the Olive Blossom storms into Saint Lucian waters, probably blown off course, definitely unprepared for what happened next. The Kalinago ran them off. Not through negotiation or diplomatic exchange, but through clear demonstration that these waters belonged to people who knew how to defend them. This becomes a theme that repeats for decades. By 1635, France claims the island from their base in Martinique, waving a letter supposedly signed by a Kalinago leader named Mart, who probably didn't realize he was handing over sovereignty to a distant king he'd never meet, in a city he'd never see, under legal frameworks that meant nothing in Kalinago governance systems. England claims it too, from Barbados, based on equally dubious paperwork involving Charles V and grants to nobles who'd never set foot in the Caribbean. Neither side asks the actual residents what they think about this arrangement, because in European legal imagination, Indigenous peoples couldn't own land. They merely occupied it until civilized nations arrived to make proper use of it. The French Compagnie des Îles de l'Amérique starts calling Saint Lucia a possession useful for commerce, which in 1639 meant sugar dreams and plantation schemes, visions of vast estates producing white gold for European markets. Chief Anthony appears in French records during this period, negotiating land use agreements while clearly side-eyeing the newcomers' intentions. The word negotiating here covers considerable ground. Sometimes it meant diplomatic councils where terms were discussed. Sometimes strategic delays where nothing got resolved. Sometimes outright refusals that the French simply didn't record because acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty undermined their legal claims. The British and French both established tiny settlements that immediately struggle against realities they hadn't anticipated. The tropical heat kills Europeans unused to equatorial intensity, their bodies failing in humidity that never broke. Diseases spread through cramped quarters where settlers lived too close, drank contaminated water, and lacked immunity to local pathogens. Supply ships arrived late or not at all, delayed by Atlantic storms, or redirected to more profitable ventures. And the Kalinago, watching these stumbling attempts at colonization, weren't exactly rolling out welcome mats or offering agricultural advice to people who'd arrived claiming ownership. Europeans claiming islands they didn't control is like someone checking into a hotel they haven't booked, then acting surprised when security shows up. But the paperwork kept flowing back to London and Paris. Cartographers drew borders on maps, and once sugar entered the conversation, the violence was about to scale from skirmishes to systematic warfare. Between 1640 and 1660, both French and British settlers arrive with axes, sugarcane seedlings, surveying equipment, and massive underestimations of Kalinago resistance. The Kalinago were skilled archers who knew every mountain pass, every hidden trail, every river crossing where ambushes could be set. Night raids wrecked colonial camps, burning supplies and forcing Europeans into defensive positions. Ambushes turned supply routes into death traps where pack animals and soldiers disappeared into forest that gave up no secrets. Colonial letters complained of ambuscades at every turn, as if defending your homeland from armed invaders was somehow unsporting or violated rules of civilized warfare. French Governor Charles Howell documented being repeatedly pushed back into coastal footholds, his settlements confined to narrow strips of land within sight of the ocean, while the island's interior remained firmly Kalinago territory. His reports to Paris grow increasingly frustrated. They need more soldiers, more supplies, more support. English reports from Thomas Warner noted that settlers perished by the climate and the Carib, that convenient European habit of blaming weather and indigenous peoples equally when colonial plans collapsed under the weight of their own impossibility. The violence wasn't one-sided. European guns killed at distances bows couldn't match. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, spread faster than any weapon, killing people who'd never seen a soldier. But the first war for Saint Lucia wasn't the famous conflict between France and Britain that history books emphasize. It was the battle between both empires and the people already living there, defending land their ancestors had inhabited for centuries. The Kalinago fought with advantages Europeans couldn't replicate. Terrain knowledge earned through generations, the desperation of defending home rather than conquering territory, and tactical intelligence passed down through oral traditions that documented successful defense strategies. They knew which trails became impassable during rain, which ridgelines offered defensive positions, which valleys could trap pursuing forces. Some Kalinago communities negotiated temporary peace agreements, trading limited land access for manufactured goods or promises of autonomy. Others maintained constant military pressure on colonial outposts, making expansion impossible and survival uncertain. The historical record shows both strategies operating simultaneously across different regions, which makes sense. No population responds to invasion with a single unified strategy. People make choices based on local conditions, family safety calculations, immediate threats, and available options. By 1660, European control remained limited to scattered coastal settlements that required constant reinforcement from Martinique and Barbados just to survive. The island's interior, its mountains, forests, and river valleys, stayed beyond colonial reach, defended by people who refused to surrender homeland to strangers with paperwork. But the demographic catastrophe was already in motion, diseases working faster than arrows, and the real nightmare of industrial-scale enslavement was about to be forced across the Atlantic. In 1664, Britain attempted formal settlement under a charter granted to the Duke of Courland, a weird Baltic duchy involvement that suggests how confused and opportunistic Caribbean colonial politics had become. Anyone with capital and noble connections could acquire paper ownership of islands they'd never visited. France didn't care about legal niceties or Courland's claims. They sent more settlers and called it French territory based on prior occupation. Meanwhile, epidemics tore through Kalinago communities. Smallpox arrived in waves. Measles killed children at horrifying rates. Diseases that had ravaged indigenous populations across the Americas now reached the Lesser Antilles. Warfare added to the death toll. European weapons, scorched earth tactics against villages, and deliberate destruction of food crops created cascading disasters. The demographic collapse pattern replicated across the Caribbean. First contact, then catastrophe. Populations declining by 90% or more within a few generations. The few surviving documents from this period are almost all European accounts, plantation ledgers, and administrative reports. When an enslaved woman appears in a 1674 French inventory, listed only as Marie, aged about 16, we get no origin story, no family name, no indication of which African region she was captured from, no voice preserved in the archive. just a valuation next to farming equipment, 800 livres, same as a good plow horse. Archival silences speak volumes about whose lives Europeans bothered recording and whose humanity they acknowledged. Colonial economies shifted from tobacco to sugar during the 1660s and 1670s, which demanded entirely different infrastructure. Sugar required mills to crush cane, boiling houses with massive copper vats, curing sheds, distilleries for rum production. The initial capital investment was enormous, but potential profits dwarfed other crops. According to plantation mathematics, this required massive labor forces working in synchronized systems, field gangs cutting cane, mill workers feeding rollers, boiling house crews monitoring temperatures, coopers making barrels, carters hauling hogsheads to ports. European indentured workers died too quickly in the tropical heat, their contracts ending in graves within months. Indigenous populations had been devastated by disease and warfare, survivors retreating to defensive positions or fleeing to islands with stronger Kalinago populations. So the plantation system turned to forced African labor on an industrial scale, building an economic model so brutal and profitable it would shape Caribbean demographics and global capitalism for 3 centuries. Plantation ledgers from the 1670s show ratios of enslaved workers to European settlers often reaching 10 to 1, sometimes 15 to 1 on the largest estates. Those numbers tell you everything about colonial priorities: profit over humanity, production targets over survival rates, quarterly reports to London investors over human lives burning out in cane fields. Sugar is sweet because someone else paid the price in blood, sweat, shattered families, and calculated brutality. And while France and Britain kept fighting over who got to extract that price, the people doing the actual labor, cutting cane in pre-dawn darkness, feeding mills that crushed bones along with stalks, boiling juice in copper vats that burned skin at the slightest splash. They were already developing resistance strategies that would outlast any European treaty. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 tried to settle European territorial disputes after the War of Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict about dynastic succession that killed hundreds of thousands. Britain and France divided Caribbean islands like chess pieces, negotiating spheres of influence and trade monopolies. Saint Lucia's status, officially undecided, declared neutral territory. Both sides still claimed it. Some historians call this diplomatic ambiguity. Others call it delayed violence. Plantation development intensified, regardless of which flag flew over Castries Harbor that particular year. Enslaved people labored from pre-dawn to well after dark during harvest season, cutting cane with machetes, hauling bundles to mills, feeding rollers that could catch clothing and pull bodies through, boiling juice in temperatures that made the already brutal heat feel doubled, refining sugar through multiple stages, packing barrels for shipment. The work never stopped during harvest. Cane had to be processed within hours of cutting or sugar quality declined, meaning shifts that lasted 18, 20 hours, workers sleeping in fields. The French Code Noir of 1685 regulated this system, with 60 articles specifying everything from religious instruction requirements to punishment schedules: whipping, branding, mutilation for escape attempts, execution for striking masters. Article 38 stated fugitive slaves absent a month would have ears cut off and be branded. 2 months meant hamstring cutting. Third offense meant death. A brutality manual masquerading as law, presenting industrial violence as reasonable regulation. Jean-Baptiste Labat, a French priest and plantation engineer, wrote detailed descriptions of sugar production techniques in his Nouveau Voyage aux Îles de l'Amérique during the early 1700s. His technical enthusiasm for mill efficiency, processing methods, and profit maximization unintentionally exposes the cruelty he'd completely normalized. When he mentions that workers must be supervised constantly to maintain production, what he means is people resisted constantly and required armed overseers. When he notes production occasionally falls below expectations despite adequate labor, he's describing systematic sabotage. Because enslaved workers did resist, constantly and creatively. They worked just slowly enough to reduce yields without triggering whipping punishments. They broke tools in ways that looked accidental, a hoe handle snapping at a weak point, a cartwheel developing cracks. They misunderstood complex instructions, forcing overseers to repeat and explain eating time. They shared information through drum patterns that carried messages across plantations, work songs that coordinated resistance activities, and coded conversations that sounded innocuous to European ears but carried meaning to those who knew the language. The archive shows the violence in plantation ledgers, punishment records, sale documents. Reading between those lines reveals the humanity, the strategies, the determination of people refusing to be reduced to machinery, despite systematic efforts to dehumanize them. Meanwhile, European wars kept escalating, each treaty merely setting the stage for the next conflict. Between 1730 and 1770, Europe couldn't stop declaring war on itself, and the Caribbean paid the price every time. The War of Jenkins' Ear supposedly started over a British captain's severed ear, but actually involved trade disputes and colonial competition. The War of Austrian Succession involved half of Europe picking sides over royal inheritance. The 7 Years' War became the first truly global conflict, fought across 4 continents, and Saint Lucia switched hands so many times, even colonial administrators lost count. French in 1746, British in 1748, French again in 1763, back to disputed territory, sometimes without islanders even being informed until new soldiers showed up at the docks speaking a different language. Local reality during these wars. Plantations expanded regardless of which flag flew. The enslaved population grew through continuous forced importation, not natural increase. Infant mortality remained staggering, mothers watching children die from malnutrition and preventable diseases. Families struggled to stay intact as members got sold to different estates or worked to death. Survival required daily tactical decisions: how to avoid the overseer's attention, how to secure enough food, how to maintain family connections, how to preserve cultural memory despite prohibitions. A 1763 British colonial report noted Saint Lucia was fit for sugar production but turbulent in disposition. Official code for constant resistance that administrators couldn't quite suppress. The word turbulent appears repeatedly in Caribbean colonial documents, a euphemism for enslaved populations who refused to accept their status quietly. Baron de la Barre, French administrator during the 1760s, pushed sugar monoculture even harder, increasing production quotas and expanding estates into previously uncleared forest land. More land cleared meant more labor demanded. More labor meant more people captured in West African regions experiencing their own upheavals, survived the Middle Passage in conditions designed to pack maximum human cargo, arrived shackled in Castries Harbor to be sold at dockside auctions. The economics were brutally simple. Sugar prices in London and Paris determined how hard enslaved people worked in St. Lucian fields. Good harvest season in Europe? Lower prices, higher quotas to maintain profit margins. Bad European winter? Panic buying by merchants, impossible production demands. The entire system ran on treating human beings as variable costs in a ledger, units of production to be optimized. Empires fought enormous wars over trade routes and colonial possessions. Diplomats negotiated treaties that reshuffled territorial claims. Admirals earned titles and pensions for naval victories, but ordinary people, those growing the cane, those chained in shipholds, those watching family members sold away, those working until their bodies failed, they did the actual suffering, while Europe's kings and ministers played strategic board games with human lives as pieces. In 1778, France entered the American Revolution on the colonists' side, and Britain panicked about losing Caribbean revenue that funded the empire. Sugar Islands generated more income for the crown than all 13 American colonies combined, which tells you what Britain actually cared about protecting. Saint Lucia became a strategic front line almost immediately, its harbors valuable for naval operations. The Battle of the Cul-de-Sac in December 1778 saw British Admiral Samuel Barrington defeat a French fleet in Saint Lucia's natural harbor near Castries. The tactical victory gave Britain control of the island and its valuable anchorage. Fortifications went up rapidly on Morne Fortune, the hill overlooking Castries that offered commanding views of approaching ships. British soldiers dug entrenchments, mounted cannons, established supply lines. Planters panicked about something else entirely. Enslaved workers hearing about liberty, natural rights, and revolution being discussed across the Atlantic. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts anymore. They were real political movements challenging monarchies and established orders. British dispatches from 1779 and 1780 described dangerous French Republican ideas circulating among the enslaved population, as if concepts like freedom were contraband that could be confiscated at customs. The planters' fear wasn't irrational paranoia. They lived outnumbered 10-1 by people they'd brutalized for generations. Every distant revolution, every philosophical treatise about rights, every whispered rumor represented potential catastrophe for the plantation system's fundamental logic. So they doubled down, increased surveillance, tightened movement restrictions, escalated punishments for infractions, prohibited gatherings. But you can't terrorize people into forgetting they're human or unaware of what's happening beyond plantation boundaries. Information traveled through maritime networks. Sailors carried news. Merchants spread rumors. Enslaved people working in ports overheard conversations and shared intelligence. And when the French Revolution erupted a decade later, those dangerous ideas would return with revolutionary armies and promises of liberation. In February 1794, the French Revolution's radical phase reached the Caribbean when the National Convention in Paris abolished slavery in all French territories. The decree declared that all men, without distinction of color, domiciled in the colonies, are French citizens and enjoy all the rights assured under the Constitution. Saint Lucia briefly became known as L'Anse la Liberté, Liberty Bay, though British forces controlled much of the island. Thousands of enslaved people seized freedom with both hands, many joining French Republican forces as armed brigades. Victor Hugues, the French Revolutionary Commissioner who arrived to enforce abolition and organize resistance against British occupation, armed formerly enslaved men and organized them into military units. For freed people, this represented not just emancipation on paper, but recognition as citizens with rights to defend and bear arms. For British colonial forces watching from their fortifications, this represented absolute nightmare. Black soldiers fighting in organized units for their own liberation. Britain invaded repeatedly starting in 1795, sending forces from Jamaica and Barbados. What followed was years of guerrilla warfare across St. Lucia's mountain interior. brutal fighting in terrain that favored defenders who knew every trail. The freed population defended their liberty with what a furious 1795 British military report called unanticipated discipline and determination, because apparently Europeans remained perpetually surprised that black soldiers fought strategically and courageously when freedom was at stake, rather than accepting re-enslavement quietly. The fighting was vicious and sustained. Plantations burned, their great houses torched, and cane fields set ablaze. Fortifications changed hands multiple times. Mountain passes became battlegrounds where ambushes killed dozens. Former slaves who'd cut cane for masters now fired muskets in organized brigades, used tactical knowledge gained from years of observing European military operations, and fought with the desperation of people who knew defeat meant chains reimposed. The British controlled coastal towns where their naval power meant something, but the interior belonged to the freed population and their French Republican allies. The war lasted years, sputtering and flaring as reinforcements arrived or withdrew, neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Think about what this moment represented historically. People who'd been legal property 3 years earlier were now defending a republic that recognized their humanity, however imperfectly. However brief this revolutionary period would prove, however compromised by European revolutionary politics and racial hierarchies, that transformation mattered profoundly to those who lived it. Liberation isn't granted by enlightened rulers. It's taken by people who refuse to remain enslaved and who organize force to defend freedom once claimed. But Britain had enormous resources and no intention of allowing this experiment in black liberation to survive where it might inspire similar rebellions across the Caribbean. General John Moore led the British reconquest beginning in 1801, and by 1802 slavery was reinstated across the island. Napoleon's France had already betrayed its own revolutionary promises, reimposing slavery in colonies like Guadeloupe and Saint-Domingue, where racial hierarchies reasserted themselves under military rule. Britain certainly never intended to abolish the plantation profits that funded imperial expansion. The brief era of liberty ended in chains reimposed, tribunals established to identify and punish resistance leaders, legal mechanisms designed to restore the old order. But the island's interior mountains became resistance zones, where small maroon bands operated from camps hidden deep in forest that European soldiers couldn't navigate safely. These weren't large organized armies anymore, often just handfuls of people who knew the terrain intimately through generations of accumulated knowledge. They conducted night raids on isolated plantations, cut supply lines that connected coastal towns to interior estates, spread misinformation that led British patrols into ambush terrain where valleys became death traps. The landscape itself became a weapon more powerful than muskets. Steep ridges that exhausted pursuers, dense forest where visibility dropped to yards, hidden valleys that could shelter entire communities, river gorges that swallowed soldiers unfamiliar with the routes. Colonial reports complained bitterly about brigands in the mountains, which was the polite administrative term for people who refused re-enslavement and possessed the skills to evade capture. The British offered substantial cash rewards for maroon captures, sent regular patrol squads into the interior, burned suspected camps when they found them, and executed captured resistance fighters as examples. Sometimes they caught people, broke up camps, forced survivors deeper into increasingly remote territories. More often, the forest kept its secrets and the raids continued. Jean Quina, a free man of color who'd fought with the French Republican forces, was captured and executed by British authorities in 1803 for continuing armed resistance after the reconquest. His trial record survives in colonial archives. A rare documented case among thousands whose resistance went unrecorded because colonial administrators preferred not to acknowledge the scale of opposition. The official charge was inciting rebellion and making war against His Majesty's forces. The actual crime was refusing to pretend slavery was legitimate after experiencing freedom. After 1814, following Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the flag finally stopped changing. Britain kept Saint Lucia permanently, and the plantation system continued extracting wealth and lives for another generation. But even after re-enslavement, resistance continued in forms refined by survivors who'd tasted freedom and refused to forget what liberation felt like. In 1834, Britain abolished slavery across its empire through the Slavery Abolition Act, but replaced it with apprenticeship, a transitional system forcing formerly enslaved people to continue working for former masters for 4 to 6 years without wages, supposedly to prepare them for freedom. As if people who'd run complex plantation operations for generations, who'd maintained sophisticated family structures and cultural systems under brutal conditions, who'd organized rebellions and resistance networks, needed training in being human or capable. The apprenticeship period from 1834 to 1838 was explicitly designed to ease the economic transition for planters who were losing their property, not to benefit the people finally escaping bondage. Former slaveholders received government compensation for lost property, 20 million distributed to British slave owners, equivalent to billions today. The enslaved people who'd created that wealth through generations of forced labor received nothing. An 1835 complaint sent to the governor from apprentices in Soufrière, a town on Saint Lucia's southwest coast, protested forced plantation assignments and working conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. These weren't polite requests for better treatment. They were flat refusals to accept continued bondage under a new label, demands for actual freedom rather than semantic games. Josephine Charles appears in Soufrière parish records as one of several apprentices penalized for absence from assigned labor, colonial administrative code for asserting bodily autonomy. When the records state she was absent or refused duty, what they actually mean is she decided her time belonged to herself, not to a former master who now claimed her labor under apprenticeship laws. Multiply that individual choice by thousands across the island, and you understand why the apprenticeship system collapsed earlier than colonial authorities had planned. Full legal emancipation finally came in 1838, but freedom without land, without capital, without access to education systems, meant freedom to struggle in an economy still controlled by the same planter class. Former slaveholders controlled the best agricultural land through generations of colonial land grants. Wages were deliberately kept low through employer coordination. Housing often remained tied to estate labor, creating economic coercion that replaced legal bondage. The legal architecture of slavery dissolved in 1838, but economic structures persisted, adapted, found new forms. Ending slavery on paper isn't ending exploitation. It's just making the exploitation require slightly more bureaucratic paperwork. But freed people built communities where possible, purchased small plots when they could scrape together capital, organized mutual aid systems and church networks, and survived despite colonial economic systems designed to keep them dependent on wage labor at poverty rates. Starting in 1858, British colonial authorities began importing indentured laborers from India to supplement Caribbean plantation labor after emancipation had disrupted the reliable workforce. Chinese migrants followed in smaller numbers during the 1860s. The contracts seemed voluntary compared to slavery, and legally they were, but terms were highly restrictive, wages kept minimal, return passage often contractually denied or made practically impossible, and treatment on estates sometimes differed little from earlier systems. The ship Palmyra arrived in Castries Harbor in May 1859 carrying 324 Indian workers, mostly from regions around Calcutta and Madras, experiencing economic distress. Immigration registers documented names, ages, villages of origin, caste backgrounds, contract terms. These workers built Hindu temples and Muslim mosques, brought Tamil and Hindi languages, contributed food traditions like roti and curry preparations, formed communities that became permanent parts of Saint Lucia's demographic landscape. Their descendants remain integral to the island's national identity, contributing to politics, business, agriculture, and culture. But indenture wasn't freedom in any meaningful sense. Workers faced legal penalties for contract violations, lived in estate barracks that resembled previous slave quarters, worked under overseers who often used similar management techniques. The plantation machine adapted to new labor sources while maintaining its fundamental extraction model: pay minimum wages, control workers' movements through debt and legal restrictions, extract maximum production during contract periods. The island's demographic composition became increasingly complex. Afro-Caribbean families descended from enslaved Africans, Indo-Caribbean families from indentured workers, Chinese merchants and laborers who'd completed indenture and moved into small businesses, mixed populations negotiating survival under colonial economics that consistently favored European planters and British merchant houses above all other groups. Each community maintained distinct cultural practices, languages, religions, foodways, despite colonial pressure toward assimilation. Mutual aid organizations formed within ethnic communities, providing support networks. Religious institutions, Catholic churches, Protestant missions, Hindu temples, Muslim mosques, provided community centers and social services. Small-scale farming on marginal lands supplemented estate wages. The plantation system adapted to post-slavery labor markets, but so did working people, building lives in the margins, creating culture from fragments, surviving despite everything. The Great Depression hit plantation economies with catastrophic force. World sugar prices collapsed. Estates that operated on narrow profit margins suddenly faced massive losses, and workers who'd barely survived during prosperous times now faced starvation wages and impossible conditions. Across the British West Indies, labor rebellions erupted starting in 1935 as workers organized, demanded rights, and refused continued exploitation in an economic system that treated them as disposable. In Saint Lucia, sugar workers walked off estates in coordinated strikes during 1935 and 1936, demanding wage increases and improved working conditions. Colonial office reports from London worried about seditious sentiment spreading among the laboring classes, which usually meant people demanding wages sufficient to support families rather than accepting poverty as natural condition. British administrators viewed emerging trade unions as dangerous foreign influence, communist agitation or American radicalism, rather than organic responses to generations of exploitation. George F. L. Charles, born in Castries in 1916, became a prominent voice for workers' rights during the 1940s and 1950s. A teacher by profession, he organized the Saint Lucia Labor Party and used education and political mobilization to challenge colonial economic structures. He'd later serve as chief minister in the 1960s, but during the Depression era, he represented a generation of St. Lucians recognizing that political consciousness wasn't imported ideology. It grew directly from lived experience of watching parents and grandparents work themselves into early graves for poverty wages that kept families in perpetual debt. Labor organizing faced constant institutional obstacles. Union meetings were prohibited without permits. Organizers arrested on vagrancy or sedition charges. Strikes broken by police deployments. Leaders threatened with deportation or imprisonment. But the momentum proved unstoppable, fed by decades of accumulated grievances and new political frameworks spreading across the colonized world. This wasn't dramatic revolution in the 1790s sense, with barricades and manifestos. It was the slow, grinding work of building institutions that could challenge colonial power structures. Unions, political parties, newspapers, educational organizations. Political consciousness is rarely dramatic or sudden. More often, it's exhausted workers deciding collectively they deserve better. Then organizing systematically to demand it, despite institutional opposition. Saint Lucia moved toward independence in careful stages spanning decades. Associated statehood with Britain came in 1967, granting internal self-governance, while Britain retained control over defense and foreign affairs. Political parties formed along ideological and personality lines. Elections happened with expanding voter franchises. Local leaders gradually replaced colonial administrators in government ministries. Full independence finally arrived on February 22, 1979, with Sir John Compton serving as the first Prime Minister of the sovereign nation. The independence ceremony featured all the expected symbolic elements: flags raised and lowered, speeches about new beginnings, formal transfers of constitutional authority, celebrations in castries. But nationhood isn't truly created in a ceremony. It's an inheritance of endurance, shaped by centuries of resistance, survival, and cultural persistence against systematic efforts at erasure. The island's national identity formed from multiple layered sources: Kalinago survival strategies and ecological knowledge that persisted in place names and agricultural practices, African cultural memory preserved through slavery and music traditions and religious syncretism, Maroon tactics refined in mountain camps that became part of collective historical memory, Indo-Caribbean contributions to cuisine and festival traditions, generations of labor organizing that created political institutions and slow democratic mobilization that challenged colonial hierarchies. Independence meant Saint Lucia finally controlled its own governance, elected its own leaders, set its own policies. But it also inherited colonial economic structures designed to benefit imperial centers, educational systems originally created to produce subordinate colonial subjects, land ownership patterns concentrated in relatively few hands, and global market forces that still systematically favored former colonial powers through trade relationships and debt structures. Sovereignty is deeply complicated when centuries of extraction have fundamentally shaped every institution. The Pitons, those twin volcanic peaks, became official national symbols, featured prominently on flags and currency, representing something that predated all colonial conflicts. The island itself, geological formations that had watched empires come and go. Cultural festivals celebrated Creole language and patois as legitimate rather than degraded, honored African drum traditions through organized performances, recognized Indian Arrival Day and Chinese contributions, embraced the national identity as deliberately plural rather than singular. Challenges remained immediate and pressing: economic dependency on tourism and banana exports, vulnerability to hurricanes in an era of intensifying storms, climate change threats to coastal communities, emigration draining educated professionals toward better opportunities abroad. But Saint Lucia entered independence with something invaluable: collective memory of survival, resistance traditions passed through generations in stories and songs, and hard-won knowledge that they'd outlasted empires before and would persist beyond current challenges. Picture the Pitons at dawn, purple shadow sliding down their slopes as sunlight hits the peaks first, then gradually illuminates the valleys below. Somewhere beneath that dense canopy lie old trails carved by Kalinago hunters tracking agouti through the forest, maroon fighters moving supplies between hidden camps, and freedom brigades from 1795 defending positions against British regulars. Waves hit the western shore with the same rhythmic pattern enslaved workers once matched on drums during festivals, quiet signals of survival and resistance coded into sound that carried across plantations. Saint Lucia's history isn't ultimately the story of who won the island in 14 different conflicts. It's the story of the people who refused to lose themselves despite everything. Through centuries of invasion, systematic enslavement, brutal exploitation, and ongoing struggles, communities preserved languages and dialects, maintained cultural traditions and religious practices, protected knowledge systems passed through generations. They built family structures, despite colonial laws, that prohibited legal marriage between enslaved people. They maintained African cultural memory despite prohibitions on drumming and dancing. They organized labor unions despite colonial suppression. They achieved political independence despite empires preferring permanent subordination of colonized peoples. The mountains have witnessed empires come and go, watched flags change 14 times, observed fortifications built and abandoned. British soldiers who died in Morne, fortune fortifications defending strategic positions, are forgotten except by specialized military historians. French administrators who signed plantation orders and tax assessments are historical footnotes. Colonial governors who implemented policy are names in archives. But the descendants of Kalinago who first named these peaks, of enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage and built lives from fragments, of indentured Indians who crossed oceans under restrictive contracts, of Chinese laborers who stayed and built businesses. They still live here, still fish these waters using techniques refined over generations, still farm these volcanic slopes, still tell stories passed from grandparents who remembered other grandparents who remembered. And they're still standing, permanent as the mountains themselves.